Welcome back everyone to another video. My name is Luke Jean, and today we're going to be tackling challenges to God's existence through the discovery of the historical Yahweh. So, for those of you who don't know, I'm a history major, and I'm a big biblical historian. At the same time, I'm a theist. I'm a believer in God as my parent and as the being I need to have a relationship with. Now, the challenge that has come up from the historical and archaeological fields is that God is actually first El and then Yahweh. Could be also Baal. Sorry, Christians. Could be Baal. Could be Asherah. It could be several deities that are associated with the Canaanite pantheon. Now, for those who are steeped in the Judeo-Christian faith, and including unificationists, the notion that God is not just God, capital G, but are historical, archaeologically proven parts of the Canaanite, which, as people of faith know, was the enemy of the Israelites in the Bible, the Canaanite deities. This is a huge challenge for theists, for people of faith, and it's been talked about extensively online by many skeptics and many new atheists. One prominent example is the example in the book of Samuel, where God commands Saul to kill all the enemies, and not just the men, but also the women, the children, and even the cattle. And Saul does all of it minus killing the king and killing a few animals. And of course, my cat happens to pop by just as I talk about killing animals. But my cat would be happy because Saul said, or decided not to do it. But God got very angry at this and regretted making Saul king after he disobeyed his commands. Now, from one side, you need to obey God's commands and have faith. But on the other hand, a few challenges come up, specifically if you're a unificationist. Number one, unificationists believe that if God is a perfect being, then he cannot interact and participate in the imperfect, immoral acts of human beings. It says that in Divine Principle chapter 2, section 6, where it talks about why God did not intervene in the fall of the first human ancestors, another very common stumbling belief for religious people in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Another problem is that if God is this perfect original creator being, then why is God presented as El, which is the chief god in the Canaanite pantheon, Yahweh, which is actually a minor desert raider god, and at some points Baal, which is an ocean storm god. I could be wrong on the ocean part, but is also a storm god, but is kind of like the big brother to Yahweh. And why also are there mentions of God having a wife, Asherah, etc., etc. These are issues that have been uncovered, or these are facts that have been uncovered by historians and archaeologists that have become issues for religious believers. And online, it's been a big problem in the sense that theists, those who believe in God in the Judeo-Christian tradition, at least from what I've seen from debates from figures like Alex O'Connor versus Mr. D'Souza, Alex O'Connor, who is a big skeptic and atheist, absolutely destroys D'Souza and whoever else he talks to, for the most part, on this issue of why God commanded the Israelites to kill everyone, including the cattle, and all the other immoral acts of the Bible. And as a historian, I'm not going to ignore these things. But at the same time, I want to challenge my faith and see if my faith is proven stronger through a steep, deep investigation. And my investigation has concluded that it is possible to still believe in an original, loving creator God and acknowledge the historical facts. But to do that, we have to get out of our commonly held, sometimes doctrinal beliefs in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And we have to acknowledge the real ways that God has to manifest God's being in human society. And so the point about God being perfect and therefore cannot enter into the acts of human beings is a very important point that will be manifest throughout this video. But for this discussion, there are going to be a few axioms or statements that are going to be treated as fact even though they are not being extensively proved. The first is that the universe was created by a conscious creator. Not saying God, not saying any, all I'm saying is that the universe was created by a conscious creator. The second axiom is that a relationship between free-willed conscious beings, such as human beings, requires mutual participation. In other words, in unificationist terms, a common base. In unificationist terms, in order to have give and receive action or a relationship between two participants, there needs to be a common base. For example, a relationship between a worker and a manager. The relationship only exists if there is a common base between the two people, which could be the success of the company, could be any number of things, but probably the success of the company. So, two axioms. The universe was created by a conscious creator, and then the relationship between free-willed conscious beings requires mutual participation. In other words, a common base. Now, I'm not going to treat the fact that human beings are conscious beings as an axiom because it's been, I believe, sufficiently proven by the psychological field. So, the question still remains, how can God participate in immoral humanity even though God is an original conscious creator that ideally, or I guess this is the third axiom, is that this original conscious creator is the highest standard of goodness possible. That's the third axiom. The original conscious creator, I'm going to say God for the purposes of this video, since it's addressing questions about God in the religious context. God is contains and has and is the highest standard of goodness known. Okay. Now, let's break down a few pieces of history. And for this, I'm going to share the screen and welcome to another set of complicated diagrams. But the first part isn't that complicated. So we need to define our terms. Who is El? El is the head of the Canaanite pantheon. El is described as a wise old man, so kind of like the figure with the beard, the wise old person from heaven. That's who El is. And El appears to Abraham in the book of Genesis. It is actually, according to biblical scholars, El who calls Abraham out of his tent and into the adventure that follows. Next, who are Baal and Yahweh? Now, for Judeo-Christian traditional theistic believers, Baal is a chief enemy of Yahweh, of God. And the reason why is actually because Baal is a major storm god in the Canaanite pantheon. Baal is under El, but is a very prominent god in that pantheon. Yahweh is actually a super minor god within this pantheon. From what scholars know, Yahweh was a minor desert raider god. And now we're going to get into some controversy, which is that according to archaeologists and historians, the Israelites didn't necessarily come out of Egypt and settle into Canaan. Now, there's still debate about this, so we don't have any facts for sure, but some believe, and there's some evidence for this, that the Israelites were actually just a break-off Canaanite tribe that was wandering in the desert. And since some people believe they were called the Shamu. Now, the Shamu were these desert wanderers. And who better to take up than the minor raider desert storm god Yahweh? And so for some historians and scholars, they believe that's why they assembled at Mount Sinai in the desert. Now, who would God be in the Old Testament context? God would be the merging of these deities into one being after the Babylonian exile. So, some biblical scholarship 101 for everyone. According to biblical scholars, and when you examine the text closely, many of the Old Testament books after the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, many of those books are written by different authors with different perspectives, and these perspectives can be divided, broadly speaking, into the perspective of the northern Israelites and the perspective of the southern Israelites. The southern Israelites were Yahweh exclusivists. In other words, they only viewed Yahweh as the deity to worship. Now, in the north, they believed that Yahweh should be worshipped along with El and Baal, and even Asherah, which in some circles is believed to be the wife of God. Now, there was a lot of tension, as the traditional Judeo-Christian knows, between the north and the south. And God wiped out the north because they were worshiping Baal, because they were worshiping idols. They were not worshiping Yahweh exclusively. However, from a historical point of view, this was actually a very serious debate at the time. And it wasn't all that simple as, oh, you have to worship Yahweh or else you're sinning and you're going to be wiped out. It wasn't as simple at the time. But because the northern Israelites didn't survive their wipeout and exile, but the southern Israelites did, thanks to King Cyrus, etc., and they were able to rebuild their society, the southern Yahwists won. And so that's the narrative that's presented in the Old Testament Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, when they brought all the works together. Another historical fact is that these works were written over the course of several centuries, and 19th century German school biblical scholarship talks about the 4-source method. These four sources are throughout the Torah and afterwards. And these 4 sources had different perspectives, and they were written at different times. I'm not going to get into specifics because that would be a whole nother video in of itself, and perhaps a whole college course. There's a very helpful course online, a Yale open course by Professor Christine Hayes, who goes through the Old Testament from a historical and scholarly perspective, which I think would be faith challenging but very worth it. And that's why I learned most of these things. And so the Yahwists won, but it wasn't as simple at the time. And so as you got farther away from the Babylonian exile, all these deities, El, Baal, Yahweh, Asherah, they merged into one being, which we know as God, and as Jesus called him, Father, in the New Testament during his ministry. So that's the historical progression of these deities. And so if you look at them, you see El, okay, wise old man, head of the Canaanite gods, but a Canaanite god. And then you have Baal and Yahweh, who are war gods. Okay? War gods. War. Not peace, not love, not happiness, not la 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 la. No, war. Raiding. Immoral behavior at the very essence of the being, of the deity. And the Israelites knew this. It's not like at the time the Israelites were like, oh, Yahweh, but Yahweh's a master who has wrath and also love for his people. No, 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 no. It was the deity Yahweh. It was the deity El. It was the deity Baal. So the question then becomes, how do we square these two seemingly differing realities between the traditional Judeo-Christian tradition from the historical tradition, and also how do we square away God as a perfect being that interacts in the world? Okay? So this is our condition, all right? We are human beings throughout the course of history. This is not just something in unificationism or in religion. It's a fact of history that human beings over the course of history have progressed in the highest level of morality achieved at the time, right? And in the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's recognized as the progression between pre-Israelite society, Israelite society, then Christian society, and then for unificationists, the morality proposed by unificationism. And so human beings are going through these stages of moral growth, of historical growth and progression. And for the Judeo-Christian believer, we see the progression of God as progressing from a master to a father to, for unificationists, a loving father, and then finally a parent. And so for the traditional Judeo-Christian, a fact that we can come up with pretty clearly is that human beings, our morality, the progression of civilization has evolved over time. But the question is why, and it's not just a religious one where God, because if it's just a religious one, we still have to square away why. How can the perfect God work with and demand immoral acts of human beings? And to solve this question, I want to turn our attention to a man named Carl Jung, who is very popular with some modern thinkers who are at the opposite side of the new atheists, but at the same time are not strictly religious believers. These are figures such as Jordan Peterson, who is not a religious believer, but is a very staunch person opposed and against new atheists. You have other figures that are religious believers that are very steeped in the intellectual and scholarly material, such as Jonathan Pageau. These are people that many religious believers are looking to combat the new atheists and skeptics and all that. But these people are not traditional religious adherents. And the reason why, in large part, is because they take from Carl Jung and also Joseph Campbell in synthesizing the way that God works in humankind's actions. Now, we're going to go into a few concepts of Carl Jung. The most important is the concept of archetypes. Carl Jung is a psychologist, and so his job is to treat patients having all sorts of psychological issues, who need therapy, who need counseling, who have psychosis or have some sort of psychological problem. And what he finds through hundreds and hundreds of cases, and he tracks these, right? He doesn't go over all the nit-gritty data in works such as I have, which is I have and been reading the 9th volume of Carl Jung's essays, but it's scientific in this. It's because it's not just because remember, the field of psychology is very empirical, which is why it's a very strange form of science. It's not like you can run like explicit experiments. You have to gather common empirical data. And Carl Jung did this, hundreds and hundreds of cases of dreams, of myths, and of stories, not just in individuals, but in all the cultures of humanity throughout all of time. And he came to the conclusion that human beings have within its collective consciousness, in other words, within the consciousness, within the brain, the psychology of every human being, within that collective consciousness, there are common universal truths of the human experience that have been passed down through the longest possible time. And the way these are known to human beings, right, because Carl Jung describes how these truths, these archetypes, are buried within the human unconscious. And because of that, they can only be manifest to the consciousness, in other words, the place in our brain, in our psychology that we can actually interpret and see and feel and understand, is through methods such as dreams, myths, and stories, especially the hero's journey, which Joseph Campbell, for example, talks extensively about. Joseph Campbell was not necessarily a psychologist, but he was a literary scholar, and he came to many similar conclusions. But the uniqueness of Carl Jung is that Carl Jung goes deeper into the psychological level. And so for Carl Jung, human beings have these archetypes, these universal truths that are common parts of the whole human experience, buried within our unconscious, and they're made conscious through narratives, through myths, through stories, and through dreams. Okay? And so, if we look deeper here, we see that they need to have another form of give and take action in order for these archetypes to be understood. So I'll give you an example of it. One of the archetypes that Carl Jung describes is the archetype of the old wise man. The old wise man is a figure that basically, in the story of the hero, provides new wisdom, new insight, or new energy to the hero when the hero feels that he or she can't go on any further. And so the old wise man is the truth of that kind of motif. It's that the truth of that experience. And in stories, we can understand that. But in our unconscious, we can't understand it because it's not being made manifest to us, presently. We don't know. And so that's just one example of many archetypes that Carl Jung even says you can't strictly categorize them, but through empirical research, you can start to kind of put a name on it. And so when we look at Carl Jung, there is a real psychological reality to all the narratives that we hold so dear. For Judeo-Christian traditional believers, these are the narratives of the Old Testament, the narrative of Abraham, the narrative of the Israelites coming out of oppressive Egypt, going and wandering in the wilderness, and then building Canaan, and traveling to Canaan. It's the story of Jesus. It's the story of Job. It's the story of Jonah. That's why thinkers like Jordan Peterson harp on these stories so much, and that's why in the online discourse and in the discussion between the atheists and the believers, the theists, there is a great attention being drawn back to the stories of the Bible by both sides. But for the atheists, they still have a compelling argument, which is, okay, how do these stories, how does God actually work through human behavior, through human events? And the answer is through the archetypes. Because what is one of the archetypes? One of the archetypes is the wise old man. The wise old man. And so what is that archetype manifested as, perceived as? According to Carl Jung, archetypes can also be perceived in deities. Okay? And who is El? It's the wise old man deity who calls Abraham to a story of adventure in the simplest Jungian terms. He could break it down much more deeply. And so this is kind of where we get to this, all right? So how can God interact with imperfect human beings without actually interacting with imperfect human beings? Okay, that's the question. Because from the unificationist perspective, and this is a perspective I believe, a perfect being cannot interact with an imperfect being because there is no common base. It's very difficult to find the common base. The common base can only come when you have a common base at the highest level of morality of the human being. You can't with the deity, with God, because God's level of perfection is so much higher. There's no common base. So the question is, how do you bridge the gap? Because this current relationship between God and human beings, from a moral standpoint, are at way too different of levels. There is no common base right here, because God, or the original conscious creator with the highest level of goodness, could, have all these plans, all these visions, but to the human being, they can't be made. They can't recognize it. They can't see it. They won't have any ability to do it unless God comes down to the level of the human being. But God himself can't come down to the level of human being, because then the common base would have to be something that's imperfect, that's not fully moral, that is not the highest level of goodness. Okay, so that's very important. For God and human beings to have a common base, which is a necessity for relationship between conscious beings, you can't have the common base unless either we go up to God or God comes down to us. And human beings have demonstrated we cannot go up to God. We are the highest level possible, right? For example, let's take Abraham, okay? We're going to use Abraham as the first example, right? Because we know one of the archetypes is the wise old man, and it has been made conscious through the deity of El in the Canaanite pantheon, all right? We're going to take the story of Abraham, right? Conscious creator, God, highest level of goodness. Human beings at, what is it, like 2000 BC or 1600 BC, I'm not sure exactly, I can't do math quickly on the top of my head right now. Like, put it this way, 4,000-year-old morality, okay? So, since God is the highest level of goodness, it would be easier for God to come down to us, because we can't. Human beings can't. There's all the stories in the Bible which say basically we can't do it. Okay, we can't do it. Not possible. So God has to kind of come down to us. Now, how does that happen without God sacrificing the very essence of his being? God has to work with this model of our human being's internal nature interacting with our external nature, right? The human soul or the mind or whatever you want to call it. That may be a fourth axiom. Human beings have a soul, a mind, or a heart of some kind that's inclined towards goodness. Okay, that's a fourth axiom here. But I find it difficult that philosophies, religions, etc. all agree that there's some sort of internal nature that points us to goodness. It is not sufficient proof enough. I think it is sufficient proof enough. Plato, a classic example in philosophy of how he views the soul compared to how he views the body, right? So can God reach a part of our internal nature? Sure. But how can human beings can't rise up to that, just beyond that. So there has to be a common base. What is the common base? It has to be the highest level of goodness that's around to that person. In other words, to Abraham, right? So Abraham, contrary to many Judeo-Christian traditional believers, was a Canaanite, most likely. He was a Canaanite. His dad was an idol maker. He was in that region of Canaan. He was also in the region of the Mesopotamians too, so maybe he was a Mesopotamian God believer, but he clearly was a believer of in the God El, because El called Abraham. It's right in the Bible. El called Abraham to get out of his tent. So who was El to the Canaanites? To the Canaanites and to those people in the region, El was the highest deity. He was the wise old man who gave knowledge. El was the highest level of goodness around at that time. So God, who still wants to use the highest level of goodness possible, manifests himself through a relationship with the human archetypes, the universal truths in humanity, which has been personified as the deity El. And that's the common base. So think of it like a funnel. God, the original conscious creator in all the perfection, has to funnel himself into the best way that human beings can understand him. Like a funneling. God can't give everything that he is or believes, and, morality and that sort of thing. Not possible. So what does God have to do? God has to use the highest level of goodness possible, which is El. Now, here's a question. Is El real? Is El real? From the deity perspective, the little statues, temples, whatever they had back then, no. El is not real. But from the perspective of the human archetypes, El is real because it's a truth of the collective unconscious made conscious in an individual, Abraham. And that is real. That is real. That is a truth. That is reality of the human experience. So is El real from that perspective? Yes. Is El the actual deity? No. So here's another question. Is El, or is the being that Abraham is talking to, God? Is Abraham talking to God? Technically speaking, no. But from another perspective, from the perspective of the truth of human beings and God using and interacting with these truths at our highest level of morality, yes. Yes. He is talking to God as God is coming to him. But is El God himself? No. And that may be something that traditional Judeo-Christians, traditional believers find very heretical. But you know what? I don't think that we are in the era of religion anymore. As unificationists, this shouldn't be shocking. Because for unificationists, it is the era of unity between science and religion. What does science include? It includes history. It includes psychology. It includes archaeology. And so for me, when Abraham is talking to God, he's not talking to the God up here. He's talking to the way God can manifest himself through a relationship between the human soul and the archetypes, which are the universal truths of human beings that are made conscious through things such as deities like El. And it's the same thing with the Israelites, all right? Now we're going to go to Yahweh and the example of Saul having to kill all the men, women, children, and cattle. Yahweh, for the Israelites, which were wandering through the desert, whether they came from Egypt or break-off tribe, they were wandering in the desert at some point. Their common base, the archetype that would make itself manifest, is the raider storm god deity that brings them out of the tyranny of Egypt into chaos in the wilderness and into a unity of order and chaos in the nation state of Israel that they seek to build in Canaan. That's the deity that is the archetype that can serve as the common base for God. That archetype manifests as the deity Yahweh. Right? Wasn't important before, right? Remember, Yahweh was a minor Canaanite god, because for the Canaanites at that time, including Abraham, that wasn't the best common base to use. It wasn't the archetype that was making itself most manifest at the time. But 400 years later, for those Israelites, that was the archetype that was making itself most manifest, and that God could, through a human being's soul, through the internal nature, could establish a relationship with. Now, however, because Yahweh is still Yahweh, the minor raider storm god, and is the highest level of that the archetype can manifest at that time, the Israelites had to, and did, not have to, but did naturally, the highest level of morality of that deity of that time, which was, you kill the men, you kill the women, you kill the children, and you do kill the cattle. For whatever reason, that was the morality of Yahweh, of the highest possible morality, the highest expression of this archetype of getting out of tyranny and going into the wilderness, but then establishing some sort of order. That was the archetype that was the highest one, that expression of it that the Israelites could handle. There are other expressions of it that are way less violent, way less primitive. But that's all God could work with. Now, were the Israelites following God himself? From a technical perspective, no. No, they were not. They were following Yahweh, the deity Yahweh. But was God, the original conscious creator, through a relationship between our original mind, soul, etc., and the archetypes, producing a common base that could lead to some sort of progression of God's will? Yes. Were they, from another perspective, following God? Or at least, yes. You see the nuance here? Very nuanced. It's like, is Yahweh God? No. But is the truth that they are, how do I put it? Are they following the highest expression of God that is available to them? Yes. Is the expression of God and God himself different? Yes. But are they relating with the expression of God? Yes. Which means in some way, are they relating with God? Yes. But are they relating fully with God? No. They're relating with God up to the degree that they can handle. And so some things are of God. For example, do not kill, honor your father and your mother. Those were some of the moral tenets of that time. But God has to funnel only what can fit within the manifestation of the archetype to the human consciousness. And for the Israelites, it could fit into the being of Yahweh, right? Because our soul does have a relationship with our body. The archetypes are part of our psychology, part of our brain. So it's a relationship between the soul, which there's a part of the soul that God can directly relate with, and a relationship between that and the archetypes. And you have to have a common base. So the highest common base that can appear is Yahweh. Does that make sense? God relates with a part of our soul. That part of our soul, which is seeking the absolute standard of goodness, has to relate with our body, has to relate with, from a psychological point of view, the archetypes, the truths of the human experience that progresses over time. You need a common base in order to do that. What is the common base that can actually start to do that? It's Yahweh. It's that deity. So the soul, the archetypes, the soul, our body, relate with a common base, which is Yahweh, and you get whatever God can funnel into, and then the rest, which is the rate of storm God Yahweh. And the rate of storm God Yahweh is a violent deity, very violent deity. And so that deity demanded violence. And so, but was it God himself? No. Because was God directly talking to the Israelites? No. Was God directly talking to Moses? No. It was the production between the relationship between the human soul and the human body, which contains the archetypes, through a common base. And that common base was the deity Yahweh. And the deity Yahweh is the common base that contains the funneling of the original conscious creator into whatever space there is, and then the rest is filled with the actual deity, which is an expression of these archetypes in that Israelite society, which is a rate of storm God that leads them out of tyranny into chaos and then to some sort of habitable order. I hope that makes sense. So I'll say it once again. God, the original conscious creator, is perfect. And if God is perfect, God cannot interact with imperfect human beings because there is no common base available. But God can relate to a part of the human soul. So God, relating with a part of the human soul, which in unificationism is the original mind, needs to relate to the human body. And part of that, at the most deep level, is the archetypes, which are in the human unconscious that are made conscious through myths, stories, deities, and dreams. And so there needs to be a relationship between the original mind and the archetypes. And you need to have a common base. And through that common base, God is able to somehow work through this relationship. Is it God himself directly working in the relationship? No. But is God directly speaking in this relationship? No. But is God working through this relationship? Yes. God is the proof of God working through the relationship. Well, not proof, but the way God is working through the relationship is through this relationship and the common base that can accommodate the soul and the archetypes, which is the truths of the human experience, which Carl Jung says contain both positive and negative elements, right? So that's why Yahweh has good morality, but also terrible violence. The common base becomes Yahweh, and the human person listens to Yahweh. Now, is God relating? Is God directly speaking? Is God actually Yahweh? No. But is God working through this relationship? Yes. God funnels what he can into the archetype, which has its own forms and expressions, namely Yahweh, the Veda storm god. And as human beings progress in the level of morality that they can handle, the common base becomes closer and closer and closer to the standard of goodness, to the perfect standard of goodness. That is why eventually Jesus comes and takes God not, and makes God not out to be Yahweh in the Veda storm god sense, but as a father, a heavenly father, who has love for people as children. And so then the common base changes. The way that God relates through the human soul and the archetypes changes. You get a figure like Jesus, which is, according to Carl Jung, the archetype of the self. Or the child archetype, which is a savior archetype, which progresses the level of human morality. Now, this is just, I guess, my attempts at reasoning the historical, the scientific, and the religious. And what I have come to conclude is that in the Old Testament, El, Yahweh, Baal, all these figures are not God himself. It's not the actual being of God. It is the manifestation of God through God's relationship with a part of the human soul and the archetypes. So it's not God who's relating with the archetypes. It's the human soul on the foundation of the relationship between the soul and God, between the original mind and God. And then from there, the soul and the archetypes relate through a common base, and you have the deity that can serve as that common base, that and is the result of that relationship. And so is that deity God himself? No. But is God working through that deity in some way? Yes. And one way to, and as human morality increases, God works more and more. That's the conclusion I've currently come to. I would love to hear disagreements, flaws in the argument, because I want to continue to refine it, continue to seek the truth, continue to seek the spirit, and continue to be a truth seeker in all facets. So once again, if you disagree, if you have additions or subtractions you'd like to make to my argument or what I have come to so far, please do so. You can also check out a blog post I mentioned where I wrote about this called Yun and Moon, a counter-argument to the New Atheists. You can find it at my blog at seekingthe12gates.blogspot.com. And I hope to catch you next week for another interesting video.